Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I am just filled with this sense of calm after listening to the guest that we have on today. She immediately sets your mind at ease. She has this amazing topic, this amazing subject, this person who has this incredible story that I'd never heard about, really steeped in this LA lore, this history, this historical, I don't want to say criminal figure, but she's sort of borderlines that criminal element, but you wouldn't know it based on the guest that we have on today. She had just got back from a walk on the beach and she was about as calm and cool as any guest that we've ever had. But Tim, are you calm and cool as well? How are you today?
I'm doing all right. I wish I was as cool as the other side of the pillow, but I'm not as cool as Claire Hoffman. She is our guest today. She is a fantastic author, and she wrote a new book called Sister Sinner, The Miraculous Life and Mysterious Disappearance of Aimee Semple McPherson. And it is a really wild story. Yes, you mentioned LA history and kind of lore of the city of Los Angeles. She was one of the first people who built a mega church, Lance, so kind of a religious figure. And then she went missing after walking into the Pacific Ocean in 1926. And she reappeared in Mexico not long after. And it really made for an interesting mystery. And this book from Claire really kind of documents Aimee's life, and it is a great read.
And one of the more interesting things that we took from this conversation was the time frame that Aimee disappeared was this moment in history, especially in LA, in California, where fame was a new thing. People were famous, but people weren't as famous as they are today. But they were on the cusp of that with films introducing audio to it. Films were now coming around with the technology that you could talk on film and you could hear what's going on, which really launched people into a whole new stratosphere as far as fame was concerned. And Aimee had a giant microphone through her mega church and her mass following. Call it a cult, call it a religious movement, whatever it was. She had amassed this following. And even when she went through the controversy of this disappearance, this reemergence, she just put that fame into full throttle. She just used that to further put her name out there, get her face out there to spread her message. Really, really remarkable story of a remarkable woman.
It sure is. And this interview with Claire is really interesting. She was a great guest. And you can check out what Claire Hoffman is up to at her website at clairehoffman.com. And you can buy Sister Sinner right there on her website.
And Tim, before we head out to this conversation, I just want to bring up yet again that you and I are going to CrimeCon this year. It's in Denver, Colorado. It's September 5th, 6th, and 7th. We have just signed the paperwork on a session that we will be hosting with a really unique individual in the crime world, sort of a famous individual in the crime world. Not as famous as Aimee Semple McPherson, but he's right up there. Not quite sure if we should announce it now, but anyway, we will be announcing it soon, so we'll have a session there. And if anybody wants to go to CrimeCon and you haven't bought your standard pass yet, you can get 10% off by using the code Crawlspace. That's the title of this show. Crawlspace, all one word.
It sure is. All right, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for listening. We'll see you at CrimeCon, hopefully. And follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. Oh, and one more thing. If you're listening, if you're listening on Apple, you might want to switch to Spotify because we are a video show on Spotify and you can watch as well as listen on Spotify.
I just picture people on Apple saying, I wonder what they look like. Now you can find out.
You'll find out on Spotify.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with author and journalist Claire Hoffman.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Claire Hoffman. Claire, how are you today?
Fantastic. How are you guys?
We're doing really well. We were just talking before we hit record that you had gone out for a little walk on the beach, which we appreciate. And I like to think that you went out for a walk on the beach to clear your head because you were like, I'm so nervous about this interview. I just need to get the ocean sounds in, get a little therapy going. And then you that satisfied you. And now you're ready to, be a part of this hard hitting interview. We're going to throw a lot of curveballs at you here.
Right. I was that, or maybe I was going to swim away and leave my life forever and my family and one of those two.
And both of those are welcome, because then we would have content for however long you wanted us to have content.
Right. Your podcast would be like what broke me. I decided to disappear myself the morning of.
And we would have appreciated that.
As long as you return, though.
Well, yeah, with a story.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I'm originally from Iowa, and I have worked as a journalist for, I guess, 20 years, 20 plus years. My first full-time job was at the LA Times. I worked on staff there and at Rolling Stone. And I've always been really interested in religion. I grew up in a sort of religious-ish community. Some call it a commune, some call it a cult, just sort of a new religious movement in Iowa. My parents were part of the Transcendental Meditation movement. And so I actually came to journalism after going to divinity school. And yeah, I've always loved, well, first of all, I love true crime. I've always loved crime, and I love religion, and I've just been really interested in it. And so over the course of my career, I've written about everything. Like I first started at the LA Times as a business reporter and did entertainment, covered a lot of culture, celebrity, and also religion.
Interesting. The religion part. Are you a religious person, or is it the history and the text and all of the communities that are involved in religion?
Yeah, I feel like I'm more of an anthropology of religion person. I mean, the community I grew up in had a very strong belief system. And so I think growing up inside of that and then coming out of it means that I'm probably never going to be a part of something again. Although people do it, I think it's, that was it for me. but I'm really interested in it. I'm really interested in the power religion has, and it plays in people's lives, and the way it can kind of give authority, and also I would say engender experience. The experiences people have through those belief systems are really incredible and fascinating to me. So that's more my angle.
Not just incredible in a good way or a bad way, right? You're not specifically leaning towards, hey, this is damaging or anything.
No, I think it's pretty neato. I mean, some of it's really bad, and some of it's incredible. That's what I think. I think religion is one of those things that gives you the full spectrum. You can have the darkest things done in the name of religion and the most incredible things. So,
and the first person to ever say neato on the show.
I don't say it often, but I was excited to do it.
Yeah, you landed it perfectly.
That makes me sound more religious than I am.
So it sounds like you were the perfect person to write this book about Aimee Semple McPherson, with your background, your journalism history, your love of true crime stories. Yeah, do you feel that way?
Yeah, I do. I mean, her story kept kind of coming back to me, I mean, she's a name that you hear in Los Angeles. She's somebody who feels like she's an important part of the history, an important part of the kind of founding of the city, but she also feels sort of forgotten. You hear a lot about Getty or the Chandlers or, Mulholland. You hear all these names, but you don't hear hers. But I think she was somebody who was equally as formative in kind of creating the spirit of the city, so to speak, and its identity. I sort of loved all the aspects of her story, that she was this incredibly powerful woman who was a real pioneer and broke a lot of boundaries for her gender and for people in general, and sort of was the first to do a lot of things, not just for a woman, but for anybody. And at the same time, and she did all these incredible good works. And at the same time, she just had this crazy episode. And, I love trials. I don't know how many people feel that way, but I've always loved a trial story. My senior year of high school, I sort of quasi dropped out of high school. I moved in with my dad. I moved from Iowa, and I lived with him, and I went to a public high school for a day, or not a day, but a week. And it was way too much for me. And so I did independent study and stayed home and watched the entire OJ trial. And so I I feel like I've just always loved yeah, kind of the entertainment of a big trial. And this one is interesting because it's sort of like the OJ trial of the first half of the 20th century for Los Angeles. It was the most expensive trial in the city's history until the Manson murders. But I think like in terms of captivating the city and these questions about guilt and innocence, and in the way that OJ's so much was about race, Aimee's was so much about gender and about belief. There was early track work there for me.
How did Aimee get on your radar? And how did you decide that she was going to be the one that you committed the time and energy to write a book on?
Yeah, it's such a good question because as I'm thinking about like what to do next, it feels like, marriage or something where you're like, okay, I'm going to give somebody 5 or 6 years of my life. Like it's a lot. So it took a while because I'm kind of non-committal. um, and I used to drive by her temple every day. I worked at the LA Times, and the Angelus Temple, which she built in 1923 and was arguably the first megachurch in America and is still there, is right at the edge of Echo Park Lake. And I always just kind of wondered, it's like such a weird building. It's like very incongruous for the rest of the surroundings, although that's also very Los Angeles to have something that doesn't match. Yeah, I just kept hearing stuff. And later on, I got really into ocean swimming. And that's when I heard the sort of second part of her story, that she had vanished while swimming laps in 1926 off Venice Beach, which I would swim at. And it kind of blew my mind that a woman who was incredibly famous was swimming alone there in 1926. Like that right away, that's like such a sort of swashbuckling quality.
Yeah, can you take us back into Aimee's life?
Yeah, she was born in 1890 in rural Canada, and she was an only child. Her mother had been the teenage housekeeper to the man who would become her father, and raised in a really religious home. By the time she was in high school, I think she was starting to have doubts about her faith. She got really into acting and theater and elocution, and she had her head turned and was becoming popular, started to really question the kind of fundamentalist faith that she'd been raised in. When she was 17 years old, she stopped with her father at a little church in town to watch these people kind of make fun of them, actually. Like they called them holy rollers. And it was like a new church in town and some visiting preacher. And she went in, she said, just to sort of tease them and joke about them with her father. And instead, the preacher was like some really hot Irish guy with blue eyes and black hair. And she fell madly in love and was washed in the Holy Spirit. So that is sort of her as a teenager. And they fell in love and got married, and she became an evangelist or a missionary in China. And that husband ended up dying, and she had a second husband and kind of but tried for a while to be a normal woman, as they said, and, be a housekeeper, be a mother. She had 2 young kids, but she just felt incredibly called to preach. Ultimately ended up kind of leaving normal life behind, ultimately leaving that second husband behind, and becoming an itinerant preacher with her mother. And in 1918, they drove into Los Angeles, and they had this kind of incredible symbiotic relationship. Her mom was like this momager, agent, babysitter, business manager, bodyguard, maybe carried a gun, like this incredible duo. And they moved to Los Angeles in 1918 and very quickly just built a massive following. They built a small national following on their way, like as she was traveling in those years. And she'd already started a magazine, and her mother helped her, get a lot of subscribers. And so people, they had a lot of engagement, to speak of in our contemporary parlance. But, really this kind of early model of almost like an influencer. Like they were really selling Aimee. She was an attractive woman, in her late 20s, early 30s when this was happening, and people were really drawn to her. She was an incredibly charismatic person, had a really incredible ability to draw in a crowd and sort of electrify people, whatever that is, that charisma, she had it. And she was a Pentecostal, the faith that she had experienced that night when she was 17 years old with her first husband, Robert Semple, was this new faith that had actually originated in Los Angeles, involved speaking in tongues and divine healing and this really personal relationship to Jesus. So all of that meant that she had incredible power. And when she arrived in Los Angeles in 1918, she just was kind of the perfect person in the perfect place.
Was there ever anybody that they emulated in order for this to happen? It's hard for me to wrap my head around because today, I didn't even think of this question until you mentioned being an influencer. Because you can look at so many outlets of media today and say like, oh, I want to model myself or emulate myself after this person in this particular career. Was there anybody in that time period that they were looking at and saying like, oh, we can sort of mold what we're doing around this person or this organization? Or was it just totally original?
It was this moment, like when fame was kind of being created, honestly. Like there were very few people who'd had national fame like that, especially a woman. I mean, there were a few opera singers and actresses who had become nationally or globally famous. That was just starting to happen. Of course, politicians and there were ministers. I mean, it is an interesting thing that like actually ministers over in the previous 100 years had been kind of at the forefront of developing audiences and following in the sense that we think of today. They borrowed a lot from Hollywood. So then once she had her church, which she built in 1923, they did these big, they called them illustrated sermons, but these big live spectaculars that kind of owed a lot to vaudeville, I would say. There was this real sense of big entertainment, and she really embraced that. In terms of who before her, there was Billy Sunday, right, who had preceded her by maybe a decade or so, and he had been nationally famous like that, but there hadn't been female preachers in general are super rare, and there hadn't been anyone like that. And there were actors, like silent film actresses at the time, so there was this, it really is this moment when fame was just starting to be formed, because it's the beginning of, it's like something I think is so interesting, it's the beginning of a sense of like mass, right? Like this is why it's so important that she started a mega church, she started a radio station, but there just wasn't this like mass consciousness, which is sort of now such a big part of fame, because communication and media hadn't infiltrated the way it has now.
Can you tell us about the this mega church that she built?
Yeah, she built the Angelus Temple in 1923, and it's still there today. It's this giant kind of Colosseum-like building. It's round with all these pillars. It looks like sort of a wedding cake or, Roman. It's very classical and kind of romantic. It had 26 departments. It was just huge. It sat 5,300 people, but often they would do 3 services a day, so 15,000 people a day. And they would set up like speakers out on the outside because the crowds were so big, and so often it was more like 6,000 people inside and more outside. And she started a radio station the following year that had coverage up and down the West Coast and apparently as far as Hawaii. So it was a fundamentalist Pentecostal faith. It was a very lively, engaged congregation. People felt really personally connected to Jesus. The Holy Spirit was something they were inviting into their bodies and spirit, like just really this, kind of more raucous, wild, she did do healings. Like that was part of how, even before she started her church, she developed a following, and by the early 20s, people were coming in crowds all over the country to bring themselves or their loved ones to be healed. So inside the Angelus Temple, they had a miracle room that was like filled with like crutches and wheelchairs and accoutrements of people who had allegedly been healed. So she was incredibly famous in the city of Los Angeles and well known around the country and even the world. She had traveled to Australia and London, the Middle East. So she was a big personality with a big following.
Okay, so tell us about what happened when she went swimming and went missing.
Yeah, so 1926, May 18th, 1926, she goes down to Venice Beach. Her temple is in downtown Los Angeles, and she takes her assistant for the afternoon to go blow off steam, basically. And it was something that she had started to do. There was a lot of pressure in her life and not a lot of privacy. And so she went down to the beach that afternoon, checked into a little hotel, put on a bathing suit, rented an umbrella, went down to the sand to work on a sermon and to swim. And she was working on a sermon called Light and Darkness. And at some point, she asked her assistant to go make a phone call for her, like to go back to the hotel and call the temple and give them notes about the presentation that she was going to do. She had just gone to Palestine, and had I like to think of it as a PowerPoint, but it was like whatever an early slideshow was, like a lantern thing. I can't remember what it's called. Sounds cool. But yeah, these photographs that she would project somehow for the audience to see her as she wandered through this sort of Holy Land landscape. So that's what she was working on. She sends her assistant away, asks for some juice and candy, and she walks down to the water. She leaves behind almost $3,000 in cash in today's money, allegedly goes into the ocean to swim. And her assistant comes back and doesn't see her anywhere. And within 15 minutes starts to kind of panic. Her assistant's name was Emma. Emma starts walking up and down the shoreline. She alerts the lifeguards. People start searching, and she's nowhere to be found. And Emma becomes hysterical. She goes and finds the hotel owner. They call the police. They call her mother, who's back at the Angelus Temple, who immediately says she's gone. She's drowned. She's dead. Which they're like, wait, we're still we're looking for her. Like, that's, let's not jump to conclusions. But Minnie, her mother, was like, nope, just get her stuff, send the car back. Kind of a strange reaction. Over the course of the following days, there's something like 40,000 people gather on the beach to pray and hold vigil and to search for her. The police department flies planes overhead. They drag the ocean floor. 2 people died looking for her. So a rescue diver searching for her drowns, I guess, from the cold. I guess maybe diving equipment was not great at that time. I'm not sure. And another woman who is a follower of hers runs into the ocean and drowns, ostensibly also searching for her in her own way. Yeah, and it becomes, this big city story, a national story. Lady Evangelist drowns, Lady Evangelist disappears. And right away, there's just a lot of questions, right? It's weird that she's, it would be like if Kim Kardashian disappeared, you're like, wait, what? Somebody this famous can't just disappear and there's no body. Over the course of weeks, there's a lot of rumors flying around. There's kidnapping allegations. There's love affair allegations. Her mother puts out a reward for any information. And, every crackpot in the city, as they said, reached out and wrote letters and gave tips. They held a memorial service for her, which raised over $500,000 in today's money. A few days after the memorial service, she walks in from the deserts of Mexico, very much alive.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
An amazing twist in this story, and that leads to, obviously, more questions, more mystery, but I want to back up a little bit to what her mother had said. And I'm wondering if you think that what she said, while it's odd, was that some way of connecting it to spiritualism or religion, or, this was meant to be like a fated type thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question, because you see even later on during one of these court inquiries, she explains to the district attorney, who doesn't have any understanding of evangelical fundamentalist beliefs. She's like, no, we thought Jesus had taken her. And he's like, wait, what does that mean? And what she's talking about is the rapture, right? This idea that somebody who's chosen by God could just be kind of lifted up, off the earth and vanish, somewhat like the premise of The Leftovers, I guess, sort of in a different way, if you're a fan of that show. Yeah, The Rapture. There's a really famous, it's one of the most best-selling books ever, called Left Behind by Tim LaHaye. It's, this is very popular belief that at some point, Judgment Day or pre-Judgment Day, people will be just taken who are chosen. And so her mom was using that kind of language for it.
How did she get away? Like I don't understand how she was in the water and then all of a sudden she was in Mexico.
I should say, I mean, I love the story. It's, it took place 99 years ago. It has never been conclusively solved, and that wasn't necessarily my aim in doing this. I'm really interested in who she was and the choices that she made, which, obviously part of that is what choices she was making with this. So there's her version of events, and there's an alternate version of events that came out during these court inquiries. So her version of events is that she was in the water, and this couple came up to her on the beach and said, Sister Aimee, we have a sick baby. Your mother told us you would be here. Will you come to the car? The baby's very sick, and pray for the baby. Such was her reputation that she was kind of treated like this, like almost like a doctor who could save lives. And so that wasn't such an unusual experience for her. And she said, okay, yes, I'll do it. Let me just grab my towel. And they said, no, 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 like just come right now. I think they threw like a fur coat over her, and they walked up to a car that was, if you've been to Venice Beach, right? Like it's got the streets right along it. They walked her up to the street, and they opened the back door, and she sees like a pile of blankets that she thinks is a baby. And then somebody hits her and covers her mouth with a chemical, and she's blacks out, and she's pushed into the back seat. And she says, she woke up, she doesn't know how long later. She's, chained to a bed, and there's a woman named Mexicali Rose and a guy named Steve, and maybe she's going to be sold into white slavery by a guy named Philippe. I think Steve has a gold tooth. Somebody has a fedora. Mexicali Rose is this nurse. Yeah, they talk about taking her to Mexicali, and it's just a sordid story. She's chained to the bed, she's vomiting, she blacks out. At some point over the course of that month, she says she was moved down to Mexico to a shack where she was also tied up. She was apparently tortured. She had a cigarette burn on her wrist. And at some point, this shack in the desert where she was taken also had a wooden floor and a bathroom, which is just something that becomes relevant later. And at some point, Mexicali Rose goes out to get groceries, and there's a serrated can of maple syrup, and she uses the can to tie off the ropes around her wrist, and she escapes out the window, and she runs, I think, for 14 hours through the desert, through day and through night, until she gets to this little border town. But when she arrives, like right away, there's questions, because she's wearing a white dress, she's wearing a corset, she's not sunburned, she doesn't ask for water, and she's just like very clean looking. Like everyone's like, this lady is like, usually the women that were coming into this town in Mexico who were American women, were like drunks, or, who knows what kind of sordid things were happening. It was a border town. And so they just right away were like, oh, this lady seems like very clean and not thirsty. But she's taken to a hospital, and she tells her story.
What were some of the relationships she had with powerful industries, powerful people, powerful, I guess, entities in Los Angeles? How did that all factor into this?
That was part of, as she explained what happened, she believed that it was because she had been a power broker and a voice for her community, and a voice of virtue in a town that was controlled by the underworld and by vice. And so she had been, her radio station made her incredibly popular. It was a huge audience. So she wielded just a lot of heft, and she had started to take positions in local elections. So right before she disappeared in early May, she had lobbied against the kind of vice lords of Los Angeles who had wanted to have drinking in the Venice beach halls. And she, had said something like, oh, I'd rather have my daughter be dead than, dance in the beach halls, or whatever they were. And actually her measure lost. Like they had this measure to not have drinking and dancing on Sunday nights, I think, and it lost. So it actually hadn't worked, but it had been a close And it had been, a real question about sort of money and power. And she was an affiliate also of William Jennings Bryan. So the Scopes Monkey trial had just happened a few years before. And, she was a conservative Christian. She had really lobbied to have the Bible be reintroduced into California public schools. She wanted to ban the teaching of evolution. So there also was kind of this educated elite in Los Angeles that hated her, power brokers who wanted the city to be kind of emulate the elite intellectualism of the East Coast. And they felt like she was kind of a joke, with her fundamentalist beliefs and the healings and the speaking in tongues and this banning the teaching of evolution. So she was a threat in a number of different ways. And I guess the third front where she was a threat was also male ministers, like big male ministers in Los Angeles were very angry about her because she essentially was stealing. Their allegation was that she was stealing their followers. The shows she would put on at the Angelus Temple were incredibly entertaining. She would have like lions and camels and motorcycles on the stage. It was just like no one could compete with what she was doing. And so there was a lot of jealousy. And she really blamed her rival ministers as time went on for going after her. So these are like all the kind of suspects, so to speak, of who might have wanted her to be disappeared.
What happened when she got back to LA? There was a grand jury, and how did all that go?
Yeah, so there were two hearings into. There was a grand jury hearing, and later on a pretrial inquiry, and those together were this was like what became the most expensive kind of record-setting trial. During the grand jury hearing, she comes back, and just right away there is just a lot of questions about her sort of version of events. There also were all these sightings of her, right? Like up and down the coast of California, all over the country. This question about the kidnappers. There was the only eyewitness, so to speak, of the kidnappers was a blind lawyer from Long Beach who was a distant relative of President McKinley. And he said that the kidnappers had come to him in May to help broker a deal. But it was like, totally it's like, okay, the only eyewitness is blind. This is like stuff you can't really make up. But yeah, the district attorney starts sort of the grand jury inquiry is ostensibly to find the kidnappers, but very quickly it becomes like just a question about who she is and her behavior and her sex life and the economics of her business and her whereabouts.
How would this story be different if this was a man who had risen to this level of power, disappeared, came back, and had this story?
I mean, honestly, part of even finding this project was, as I said before, like I grew up in this movement and we had a guru who was a man. I was like, I felt like I had this sense of like, when religious male leaders, like it's either sex or money, like they just like this, the playbook is so standard. And what happens with women that have that kind of power, who earn or have this kind of ability to be the broker for divine revelations and sort of sacred truths? Like, how do women act with that and where do they go wrong? The answer to that question is like really complicated because it's sort of the whole story. I don't want to dodge it, but in some ways, arguably what she did was very male, right? Like if you believe that, as the district attorney began to present, that actually she ran away to be with her lover who was her employee. That sounds like kind of a standard megachurch gone wrong story, right? I think that where things get really different are how it shaped her afterwards, like the back half of her life. Like almost the way that public scrutiny and criticism changed her, and I would say like distorted her, or how she evolved in the face of crisis and criticism, that feels very particularly female to me, for ways good and bad. Again, if you believe that she faked the whole thing, I think there's a certain kind of creativity to it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
It's pretty wild how she was able to, I guess, orchestrate this disappearance and then come back. Was it part of her show, I guess, in a sense?
The question of like why and for what purposes, I should say, like the evidence, I mean, I don't in my book say one way or the other. And that was like a conscious decision. And I've like had some reviews kind of come after me about that. But I mean, ultimately, first of all, I'm a journalist and like there is no conclusive evidence one way or the other. It's essentially unsolved. And I didn't solve it. Like I didn't find like, a single smoking gun, so to speak, that would say, this happened this way or the other way. And she told the same story her entire life. She never changed the story. She told it verbatim often. But I think there is just an incredible amount of evidence for the district attorney's version of events, which was that she ran away to Northern California with her lover and lived in a love shack in Carmel by the Sea with him for about 10 days, that they were receiving newspapers and sort of watching the story get bigger and bigger. And at some point, they set up this grand return, made their way down to Tulsa and to Tucson and orchestrated her reappearance. I don't think I answered your question, though.
It's okay. I want names of people who have criticized you. Give us names.
I know, it's so annoying.
Come on.
I know, I would love to be petty. This is like my favorite thing.
We'll be petty for you.
I just like, I don't know. There's been a couple of these reviews that are like, oh, like there's no perspective. And I'm like, first of all, one thing to know about Aimee is that she's been written about since that day for a century, right? Like I'm not the first person to write about her. And I've also read every single, I'm not going to swear on this podcast, every single book about this woman, right? And there's books every few decades about her. And the thing that I found was that the like judgment about her really doesn't age well. Even if you think she's X, Y, or Z, the judgment is often incredibly sexist or bigoted or, anti-religious and, or there's pseudoscience to argue against her religiosity, so it's like, oh, there's, sort of the new field of psychiatry in the 50s is used on her and it seems pretty flim-flam. Like it seems just as sort of subjective, so to speak. So I part of me didn't want to institute my kind of 2020 judgment on her. Like the facts are so interesting. I also enjoy stories where I get to make my own conclusions, like that's the kind of reader I am. I don't like being told, and I don't like stories that kind of pop out of time and do analysis. So that was my choice. So that's the book I wrote. I like to be inside the story and then, kind of have my own takeaway.
I don't even understand what it doesn't have perspective means.
And also, like, I will say, I'm like, oh, to say I don't draw a conclusion or that I'm perspectiveless, but the person writing the review whose main knowledge of the story is based on my book has obviously come to a conclusion. So I'm like, how'd you get there? Like, I helped you. That is the perspective,
Yeah.
So anyway, whatever.
Yeah, sorry.
I just get me petty. It's so easy.
No problem.
Well, in looking at the photos of Aimee Semple McPherson, I can't help but wonder why Carrie Fisher didn't pursue a biopic and try to play the role, because I feel like she looks a lot like her.
Yeah, I mean, Faye Dunaway played her in the 70s, which was incredible. And Barbara Stanwyck did a movie, I think in the 30s I think it's the 30s, which seems so early. Maybe it was the 40s, a Frank Capra movie called The Miracle Worker. So she's definitely like popped up in culture. Another interesting thing, just looking at the photographs that I find so fascinating, is she really physically transforms in a really radical way. Like I find her almost unrecognizable from when she's a young traveling itinerant preacher in her 20s to, her late 30s. I mean, she had plastic surgery in 1930. She had a facelift, and that really transformed her. And so after these trials, she ultimately gets off. And there's a lot of questions. There's like secret FBI files with wild allegations. The trial really transformed her. The other part of the story that I think is so interesting is like it's this early prototype almost of a sex scandal or a public meltdown or somebody who maybe thought they could disappear. I just think that's such a funny moment in time when like a famous person thought they could control the narrative, like it seems so antiquated and charming. But you have to think like again, like this idea of mass and celebrity was just starting. And I think she also was somebody who was used to being able to kind of tell stories and conjure and sort of describe the unseen, let's say. And so I think she told this story really well, let's say. After the trials, she was more famous than ever. She was like this kind of uncaged animal. Like she wanted to be out in the world. Her mother was like, let's stay in Los Angeles. Let's like just wait for the attention to pass. And she was like, no, I want to capitalize it. I want my face everywhere. It was kind of an opposite impulse. Yeah, she traveled all over the country and the world, and she became more and more famous, but she also became, like a punchline, a little bit of a joke, right? She seemed to be kind of obsessed with that she had been falsely accused.
But she was kind of at the same time using that to propel her fame.
Yeah.
Which I think is brilliant. I mean, I think that's fantastic. If that's the path in which you've chosen and, your end goal is to deliver your message to as many people as possible, however you can do that, fantastic. If it means that she has to endure a little bit, or not a little bit, but she has to endure some embarrassment and defending herself, it's just putting more eyes on her.
Yeah, I mean, people bring up Trump a lot to me after they read the book because she's got this kind of ability, really masterful ability to move through scandal and move through criticism and use it. And she had that kind of Teflon ability and belief in herself that, you see in Trump, whatever side you're on, like he's incredible at that, right? Like he's really good at kind of pivoting it back to other people. And she was fantastic at that. And it's so interesting to see, again, she's like this new thing, like this globally famous woman. It was a new thing to be. And she was very playful and sophisticated with journalists. She knew how to kind of capitalize on it. She ended up doing a Broadway show. She initially tried to charge people for her sermons, although she got in trouble for that. She got very involved in a bunch of kind of business schemes. So like a real estate development, a hotel, a cruise line, a graveyard. So there was just, this real capitalizing that happened. She wanted to make a movie of her life. She hired a screenwriter. She wrote another memoir. She wrote a bunch of memoirs. Like she was very savvy in that sense.
What happened to her church?
She started her own denomination, which is called the Foursquare Church, and they have 8 million members today, something like 67,000 churches around the world. So that's the Foursquare Church, but Pentecostalism in general, which I sort of argue that she, I've said like she was almost like the Elvis of Pentecostalism because it had been something that had been created, or, one of the originators of it was an African-American man. It was interracial and really open, and then had all this conflict, with like race issues and these sort of white supremacist leaders and divisions in Pentecostalism. And she really kind of used her white lady magic to bring it to the masses. Pentecostalism today is a quarter of the world's Christians. They estimate 600 million people in the world are Pentecostal and charismatic. So she was really successful, I would say, actually, in helping get this belief system, which she, from a very young age said her entire point in life was to have the largest microphone possible, to reach as many people as possible. And over the course of her life, like the back after the trial, she made a series of choices that are kind of excruciating. She ends up very much alone and doesn't really stay connected to the people who loved her. And she made those choices repeatedly to kind of save her legacy and save her church. It's kind of unusual for a woman, I would say, where she really chose her institutional legacy over her family and her personal life.
What kind of research did you do? Were you able to get transcripts and old documents and things like that?
as I said, I read like every book written about her, even before I decided to do the project. Like that was sort of my baseline of like, okay, what's out there, what's been written, and is there more to do? The transcript for the trial is actually largely missing from the public record. In the Hall of Records, they only have 26 pages of is estimated to be 3,200 page trial document. And I looked everywhere for it. And the church claimed that they had the only existing copy. I lobbied them for a long time, and they gave me, ultimately, they were like, ta-da, like here's, 100 years later, you're the first journalist. Because after she died, her son took over, and he was very protective of her legacy and hated, perhaps understandably, journalists. He felt like they'd kind of destroyed his mother. He didn't want anyone to read these transcripts, so they released them to me, but then it was redacted. So for that, it was such a big story that the newspapers were printing transcripts for a lot of it. Like every day, the transcript of what was said in court, not entirely, but a lot of it was on the front page of the LA Times or the Herald Examiner. So newspapers were really important to me. Everybody's pretty much dead. So it was all archival.
And after you had completed the book, did you find it difficult to leave it alone, or was it still resonating with you? And what are the feelings that you had after you finished? Did you feel like sort of, like actors who have a Broadway show that goes on for a while will have that like post, that post-performance depression? Did you feel like there was something missing there?
You mean like right now? Am I experiencing that? Am I really sad?
You're sad.
No. I felt like, honestly, and I'm curious what people's experience, like originally when I pitched the book and proposed it and sold it, I didn't really have that much interest in the back part of her life. She lived another decade and a half after her trial before she overdosed on sleeping pills in 1944, just shy of her 54th birthday. I just wasn't that interested in that time period. Like I really was interested in the trial and the alleged crime and the love affair. Yeah, it actually, that ended up being the part that like really swallowed me up. Like a lot of the answers, like emotional or sort of anthropological answers about the story are there, like how she kind of integrated the criticism and metabolized it and how it changed her. I mean, she ended up going on like an all orange juice diet for years and having a series of mental breakdowns and marrying maybe like a con artist and, something like 37 lawsuits with her family, living alone with a spider monkey. It's pretty dark. And I think that time period was really fascinating to me. And then in answer to your question, I really was ready for it to be over. Like it's a really dark kind of Sunset Boulevard existence that you're like, oh, this is crazy and really interesting about human nature. And now I would like to not ever think about it again. Like to go outside.
Walk on the beach or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's next for you? Are you going to tackle something that's a little bit less dark, or are you going to go even darker?
I don't know. I mean, I'm taking suggestions right now. I have a couple of ideas, but books take so long that I like to think for a while. While I was working on this, I have been working on a detective novel just to kind of blow off steam. So I hope to bring that into the world.
Like a period detective novel, like from the LA in the 50s?
It's not. It's kind of a new age noir. Like it's more linked to the worlds that I have been a part of.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us here today on the show. Is there anywhere that you like to tell folks to pick up your book?
I mean, your local bookstore, bookshop.org, or if you're into that, Amazon. It's everywhere. And thank you guys so much. What a great conversation. Thanks for being interested in this story.